Despite appearances, this island is renowned as the most perilous on the planet. At first glance, it appears to be one of several islands in the Bay of Bengal-based Andaman Islands. Is it a form off the shore? And what mysteries does this island conceal? Your mind will be blown by the tale of one of the few uncontacted civilizations and the last known pre-Neolithic people on Earth. How on earth have these folks managed to avoid any sort of outside intervention for all these years? The remaining human population is, after all, dispersed all across the world. Despite the fact that the Sentinelese haven't set foot outside of North Sentinel Island in a very long time, it is thought that they are actually descended from one of the earliest human tribes to depart Africa. Indigenous communities often suffered devastating losses as a result of European colonization. The Sentinelese, however, have been fortunate enough to avoid colonization and have maintained very little interaction with the outside world. However, there have been a handful of such cases. Experts estimate that the Sentinelese arrived on their island approximately 60,000 years ago, making them one of the earliest known human populations to leave Africa. Another indigenous population of the Andaman Islands, the Onge, is familiar with them. From what we know about the Sentinelese, it appears that their culture is quite similar to the Onges. The Onge and the Sentinel Islanders met in the 19th century, but their languages were so dissimilar that they couldn't speak. The British brought this to light. The two groups clearly hadn't interacted for quite some time. John Ritchie, a British surveyor working for the East India Company in 1771, saw lights on North Sentinel Island. Their connection to Christopher Columbus may be fresh in your memory. In contrast to Columbus, Ritchie continued on after noting the abundance of lights and bypassed North Sentinel Island. The island vanishes from historical accounts until the wreck of the Nineveh, an Indian commercial ship, occurred on its shores in 1867. The Sentinelese, who appeared to dislike company, attacked the handful of survivors, a little over 100 people, after they had been on the beach for a few days. Just before he snuck away in a little boat, the captain noticed that the Sentinelese had iron-tipped arrows. A rescue party eventually found him and the other survivors, who had thrown stones and sticks at the Sentinelese in an effort to ward them off. British colonists in the Andaman Islands ignored the warning and avoided North Sentinel for the following 13 years. However, colony officer Maurice Vidal Portman led an expedition to the island in 1880. Accompanying them were several indigenous Andamanese people who led them onto the island and revealed trails leading to long-lost settlements. It appeared as though the Sentinelese had disappeared into the woods. Despite his happiness that they hadn't stayed to defend their home with arrows, Portman decided to persist in his search. An older couple and 4 children were among the 6 islanders he eventually located after several days of searching. As a result, he reasoned that abducting them would be the most effective means of introducing himself and his culture. Yes, I am aware. This reasoning is lacking in coherence. He escorted them to Port Blair by having them loaded onto his ship. The prisoners quickly fell ill, most likely as a result of their quarantined community's lack of contact with outside diseases for about 60,000 years. The children promptly returned to the island after the elderly couple's demise, bringing with them numerous gifts. Portman reportedly believed that gifts could entirely compensate for abduction and wrongful death. In fact, rather than expressing regret for his actions, he scorned the Sentinelese, calling their behavior an idiotic expression of countenance and manner of behavior. Portman returned to the island multiple times. He was fortunate to have survived his first introduction and the locals' general aversion to outsiders. However, he came to realize in his later years that the islanders' contacts with strangers had been detrimental. Thus, he may have felt remorse for his conduct. Aside from an escaped prisoner from Port Blair who reached the coast in 1896, the island was largely deserted after that. It appears that the Sentinelese had decided to end their relationship with outsiders, possibly due to the abduction episode, and they swiftly had him executed. If you've liked this video, please subscribe before I discuss more encounters with the island. We share incredible videos packed with facts every day. Also, click the bell button to stay updated and avoid missing out on any incredible information that could enhance your intellect. We should return to it now. Anthropologists didn't make the decision to study the island and its inhabitants, or at least attempt to, until the 1960s. Similar to what Portman experienced, Indian researcher Triloknath Pandit discovered the island to be uninhabited upon first landing in 1967. He and his men rummaged through the deserted cabins, taking what they needed for their research and leaving behind gifts of buckets, candy, and fabric. A few years later, a second contingent of anthropologists returned to the island for documentary filming. Indian police were with them, ostensibly because they were afraid for their safety. A barrage of arrows was aimed squarely at their boat, confirming their worst fears. Although they landed further down the shore, away from the assailants, arrows began to fly again not long after they left presents of coconuts, cookware, a doll, and a pig. Next, in 1981, the Primrose went aground not far from the island. As soon as they spotted the Sentinelese people rushing at them armed, the crew's pleasure at seeing land transformed into terror. They used axes and a flare pistol to fend off the indigenous after making a distress signal. The Indian Navy managed to save them in the end. You can make out the enigmatic form off the North Sentinel shore. It's the Primrose wreck. Even though the island's inhabitants were hostile, Pandit made sporadic visits there for over 20 years. At long last, he had a cordial meeting with 3 Sentinelese men in 1991. They went so far as to board his boat and examine it from the inside. Although coconuts aren't native to the island, he gave them out nevertheless, and the locals seemed to appreciate them. The Indian government then decided to halt all Sentinelese research out of concern that anthropologists and other tourists would introduce contemporary diseases to the island. It took someone over a century after Portman made his abductees sick to think of that. Indian officials have made it clear that they have no interest in interfering with island life or enforcing local laws. In reality, North Sentinel is still its own independent nation, even though it is formally a protectorate of the Indian government. Still, a few days following the 2004 tsunami, the Indian government dispatched a helicopter to survey the island. It turns out that the locals had sought refuge on higher land prior to the tsunami, dispelling their deepest fears that anyone had survived. Their fishing grounds were devastated by the hurricane, but they appeared to have adapted. A couple of inebriated fishermen dozed off on their boat 2 years later. Their improvised anchor, which consisted of a boulder strung on a rope, failed, and they drifted toward North Sentinel Island without realizing it. Other boaters attempted to sound the alarm, but the fishermen were likely too drunk to hear. You shouldn't drink and operate a boat, for a legitimate reason. As they sank into the island's shallows, the Sentinelese pounced, shooting them dead with arrows. The Indian Coast Guard attempted to recover the bodies with a helicopter, but they also encountered gunfire. After realizing that the dead seemed to be in shallow graves on the island, they eventually gave up and left. To ensure the safety of the island's residents, and anybody unlucky or drunk enough to venture too near, the Indian government has imposed a 3-mile exclusion zone surrounding the island ever since the tragedy. The Sentinelese are mostly unknown due to their reclusive nature and extreme caution about outsiders. They arrived on the island prior to the invention of agriculture, living as hunter-gatherers. They reside in larger, walled communal houses constructed from palm leaves. Javelins and flatbows are their weapons of choice. Because of its lack of natural harbors, the island is encircled by coral reefs. There can't be an accurate count of inhabitants because so much of it is forested. 50 to 500 people are thought to be involved. There are still contemporary dangers for the Sentinelese, even though the island is in an exclusion zone of 3 miles. Tour operators often promise visitors to the Andaman Islands the opportunity to witness the island's oldest indigenous communities. Some individuals have brutally exploited the Harawa, another indigenous group of the Andaman Islands. A resort's decision to construct new buildings in close proximity to the Jarawa Reserve caused some concern. Every day, hundreds of vehicles pass through the Jarawa on the Andaman Trunk Road, with their guides treating them as human safari attractions. This is why North Sentinel Island has become a source of concern for campaigners working to safeguard the Andaman Islands' indigenous population. Some local businesses have even begun to plan what they call the ultimate human safari, which involves taking passengers on protected, armored boats to the North Sentinel Island shore. Now that we live in a technologically advanced world, some researchers are thinking about sending in tiny drones to observe the Sentinelese. Ethical considerations remain, though, because this could amount to an invasion of the tribe's privacy, even though it would prevent most of the issues associated with future human contact with the people. It could be safer for everyone to let the Sentinelese people be on the world's most perilous island, regardless of how curious people are about this uncontacted community. Are you of the opinion that we ought to pay them a visit? or simply let them be? Please share your thoughts in the space provided. Also, hit that bell symbol to subscribe and never miss a video by leaving a like and commenting on this one.